Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're coming to you from Alliance Magazine in London, and we're being joined by friends and colleagues from all around the world. I'm Elika Roohi, the digital editor at Alliance and the moderator of today's webinar. We'll be discussing the relationship between climate movements and philanthropy, a relationship that becomes ever more important as the climate crisis closes in. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Fondation de France for sponsoring this event, which is part of our Climate Philanthropy 2030 project. Alliance launched this project in January of this year, committing to weekly coverage of climate philanthropy over the course of the next decade, one we believe is critical for our planet. For more information about our climate pledge, you can visit alliancemagazine.org/climate. We're also offering a subscription discount for webinar attendees, which you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen under the Offers tab. With the code CLIMATE20, you can take advantage of a 20% discount, giving you access to all Alliance content. And today's offer also includes a free print copy of our issue examining social movements and philanthropy. Now on to our main event. Climate funding still makes up less than 2% of total philanthropic funding. And our reporting on social movement philanthropy earlier this year found that movements, whether they're for climate or for other causes, receive less than 0.5% of total funding. These small fractions stand in stark contrast to the crisis that lies ahead. In the next decade, if the world is unable to make significant cuts to its carbon emissions, it faces dangerous and costly disruptions to nearly every part of life. We all have our part to play in the climate crisis, and you who are attending today, whether you represent a climate movement, a foundation, a nonprofit, or otherwise, have likely been thinking about how to approach the diverse field of climate action in the most effective way possible. So today we're asking, when it comes to movements, which are usually diverse and decentralized, where do they feel the institutional and financial power of philanthropy should be directed? And when philanthropy looks at the power of climate movements to mobilize public support, how can it help extend that reach? For this webinar, I'm delighted to be joined by colleagues who have been thinking deeply about these questions. Our panel today includes Clare Farrell, the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, Nnimmo Bassey in Nigeria, who is the chair of the Global Greengrants Fund's board of directors, as well as the founder and director of the Health of Mother Earth Foundation, and Sonia, Medina, the executive director of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation's climate change portfolio. We're also seeking your input, so please type your questions into the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. Tell us where you're from, and I'll put your questions to our panel after their opening remarks. So first, we're going to turn the floor over to Clare. As the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, could you tell us a little bit about your experience working with philanthropy?
Thank you. Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. Just quickly to introduce myself, there are quite a few people who are involved in founding Extinction Rebellion. So we have many co-founders, and my background is in fashion and ethics and sustainability, also in the mainstream fashion industry and creative sectors. So I worked a lot with the design group and the art group in setting up the kind of look and feel and working through the messaging of XR. We have a decentralized system design, which has its benefits and has its challenges as well. But ultimately, this has been a necessity for rapid growth, I think, aside from many other reasons to do with variously resilience and sense of self-organization and efficacy and all of the benefits that you get. And with that, we've caught most of our funding from public fundraising, and that continues to be the case, which is great in the sense that public fundraising gives us unrestricted funds, and there are certainly various issues that we can see in the shape of people's governance and whether or not we can tick all the boxes and jump through all the hoops for conventional kind of big funding efforts. And certainly we're really well aware of the restrictions and the issues that can come with philanthropic work and investment in our movement. We've got a group called the Catalyzers who are working in a very interesting way to mobilize people in very high-powered parts of the corporate and business space. And of course, we've had some fairly big donations variously from some wealthy individuals and some celebrities. But I guess the point that I would open with to think about here is whether or not people in this space are really acting as if this is a global emergency. I mean, the stats that you've just quoted there at the start of the presentation are quite shocking, really, considering what we're up to lose, what we can face to lose and to destroy in the coming years and decades, and you know, the fact that this that we're in this situation constitutes vast crimes against humanity. I think I do find it very, very shocking that people with huge amounts of money to spend on philanthropic ventures and foundations who are looking to support climate movements see movements like ours as very, very high risk investments. And I guess what I would ask the question is, how much risk do you need to realize that you are in and that everybody around the world is in before it's time to make some what you might feel are slightly more high risk investments, basically. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that as a starter. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire. Just given what you've just said, I'm wondering what you think, because Extinction Rebellion is really diverse and it's really decentralized, as you've said, but also, you know, foundations work in specific ways and they maybe don't want to take huge risks and they don't know how to effectively like channel their funding into movements like Extinction Rebellion or other social movements. What has worked so far in your experience with Extinction Rebellion when it comes to funding practice of big funders trying to support what Extinction Rebellion is doing?
Well, I think when we've had some sizable donations from people who want to support a certain piece of our work, you know, certainly sometimes that's helpful. So we've just had some money in the UK to help sort out our internal systems, for example, and that's something which people can imagine investing in much more easily than giving money that they think may be supporting people, you know, going out and breaking the law. For, you know, that's clearly been an issue, not just in the funding space, but also in the whole of the charity and the third sector. You know, we've not, it's not that we haven't been to ask other NGOs, other charities to come out publicly in support and out on the streets. And I have to say, you know, the hesitancy that exists in this space to be able to support, you know, a movement which has proven its nonviolent discipline, has proven its capacity to organise safely, and clearly needs support to keep it moving. You know, I think the problem here is it belongs to the third sector at large, and that people need to go back and think about how they can take bigger risk in terms of supporting this kind of non-violent action if they're serious about getting very, very rapid change, because I think it's quite clear that this has made a huge difference, what we've done and what the school strikes have done and what other youth movements have been doing around the world, particularly things like Sunrise Movement. You know, when you can see the rapid impact of this kind of work, I think it is a problem that belongs to the sector, that it needs to work out how it can deal with being able to back this work, because I don't see anything else getting the shift that we need to happen in the time that we need it to take place. You know, we're really we've put ourselves on a cliff edge. You know, and some people would argue that certain areas of the planet are already been shoved over the cliff. Right? It's devastating, and so for us to look at a space where we're regularly told that there's hundreds of millions of pounds kind of sloshing around waiting to be spent, but not able to be spent on people wanting to sit in the road or supporting people that want to go and do non-violent action. I think, there's a very, very big question here that the sector needs to ask itself. If it's not supporting non-violent direct action, why not? Because I think it's clear that it's going to be a major, major part in getting the rapid movement that we need to see.
Thank you so much, Claire. Lots of interesting things to think about there. Before we head on to our next panelist, we have a poll question. So if everyone can direct their attention to the poll button on the right-hand side of your screen. Our first poll question comes from a recent conversation that Alliance had with one of the largest foundations in the UK, which said that it only funds registered charities and that, quote, movements initiated by individuals wouldn't tend to meet their criteria. In your experience, do you think funders risk turning movements into charities? So if you've missed it, the poll button is on the right-hand side of your screen. And the question is about whether funders risk turning movements into charities. So we'll just give this a moment to let the answers come in. So I think there are still some answers rolling in, but it's looking like overwhelmingly the experience is that funders risk turning their movements into charities, which I think is really interesting to think about in light of what you've just shared, Claire. Next, we're going to turn the floor over to Nnimmo, who's someone who's both been on the movement side and the funder side. So you have worked with climate activists with your work with Friends of the Earth and Oil Watch Africa, as well as with funders in your role as the chair of the Global Greengrants board. So I would be really interested to hear what you think is missing in movement funder relationships.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on this webinar. Thanks to Claire for the presentation on Extinction Rebellion. It's been a very unique experience for me, both as an activist and also to be on the funding side, straddling the bridge, connecting the two. It's been very, very interesting because I could see the picture from the two ends of the pipe, if you allow that metaphor. What has made it very, very effective for me is that the Global Greengrants Fund is not your standard kind of funder. It's not the run-of-the-mill funder. It's a funder that runs on a philosophy that is so much activist. So it hasn't been a struggle for me at all. Understanding that the work of the Global Greengrants is basically driven by the philosophy of engaging in very participatory grant-making model that is very decentralized, depending on advisors who are working on the ground, on engaged in daily activities of defending the ecosystems, defending human rights, and fighting for justice on many platforms. I find that this is the kind of model that is so very important and flexible to respond to the kind of situation that we find ourselves in today, the kind of dramatic times that we have where things are changing every day, and what ought not to be normal is now being called a new normal. In fact, people don't even know what the new normal is. But this kind of changes have serious impacts on with rising inequalities, rising cases of racism, very blatant cases of neocolonialism, and the patterns of relationships that drive this negative trend is rising every day. And people are almost being nostalgic about going back to the days where things were done in such very terrible ways. But what the Global Greengrants model helps me to see personally is that the model allows us to listen to the voices of the struggle, to listen to the situations on the ground, to listen to the pains of communities, of women, of disabled persons with disabilities, discriminated groups of people, and also to see the vigor that comes from this kind of base. People who, despite all the disadvantages, are standing strong, are standing up and fighting for justice. Now, the benefit of having this kind of participatory model and having approaching those who require support from the perspective that not everyone is looking for big sums of money, but that tiny, small sums can make a big difference. And so there are groups that we support that have never been supported by any other kind of charity, and this is because of the model of actually having advisors, activists on the ground who are embedded in the struggles, knowing where the pains are, knowing where the aches are, and seeing people who dare to stand up against power. And of course, building grassroots power, building solidarity, and also showing that we have to care, not just about one another, but also about the invisible, about other beings that we share the planet with. So this kind of caring, this kind of community, this kind of solidarity is a spirit that can only work in the situation where you have the spirit of trust. And this is what the model that we work with does. In the Global Greengrants, we completely trust, I would say, our advisors on the ground. If we did not trust them, and if they did not trust the system, there will be a major rupture, a break that could have big challenges on the model. And so I think what I'm engaged in as an individual, or what we engage in collectively, helps us to dream together, to ask the question, why are we doing what we're doing? And the answers that we have empowers our actions.
Thank you so much, Nnimmo. Before we move on, I have a question actually that came from the chat from Sophia Arroyo at the Edge Funders Alliance. And I think just given what you were talking about with collaboration and working together, I would be interested to know if from your vantage point, you've seen examples of climate movements or other movements from the North and the South connecting and collaborating. And do you think that there's a role for philanthropy to foster those sorts of connections?
Oh, definitely. I would say that I see this happening frequently because our advisors consciously fund groups working on different planks of the same issues in some of the regions around the world with a very conscious objective of helping to forge and build and empower movements and support movements. And so collaboration is key. We don't really treat struggles in silos because almost every kind of environmental or climate related struggles you're going to find has many sides to the question, to the struggle. And so we consciously work with groups who have linkages to others. And there are many different things groups are fighting on. I can give you examples from my very backyard. I bring the example of the Ogoni struggle. Ogoni is a group of a territory in the Niger Delta of Nigeria, where the people stood up against oil extraction in 1993 and actually expelled the major transnational oil corporation and the government corporation from the territory. And they stand it very firmly up to this date as we speak. And they've not permitted any opening up of those oil wells or extraction of fossil fuels. Now, that to me is a very basic climate action, because climate action, you find that climate negotiations and discussions often talks about carbon in the atmosphere, but keeping the carbon in the ground, not bringing it out. Very positive climate action that the world needs to wake up to, that's the thing to do. And secondly, there are groups working in the Niger Delta, where I live and working, especially the women who are looking ahead to see what the possibilities of collaboration could be. What is the system moving towards? And now there's a cleaning up operation in Ogoniland, in the part of the Niger Delta, of pollution that has accumulated over a long time. And we've realized that one of the things that would help to show whether the environment is clean or not is when the biodiversity begins to revive. And so women have started creating nurseries of mangrove plants and other seed or other plants and getting ready to be engaged when time comes. And now the country, just like many other countries, is engaging in tree planting, which is a major climate action also. But we find that mangroves actually absorb a lot more carbon than other trees. And so these women working together, forming clusters and expanding their reach and working together just shows that climate movement is not only what you see in the big cities, but also what you see at the grassroots. And we've also found groups working together to create stories, to tell stories. Because one of the things that keeps activists apart is a lack of clarity about the commonalities of the struggles, because they're working from different locations and not really seeing where the stories interconnect. So there are activists who are engaged in bringing up stories together, in telling stories of struggles from different sectors, and thereby helping activists and groups to see that they're all in the same boat. This to me is very inspiring, and it's one way to bring collaborations, to build movements, and to get more people to work together.
Thank you so much, Nnimmo. You've given us so much to think about. Now we're going to turn the floor over to Sonia. So Sonia is here representing SIF, which is a major funder of climate. I know SIF has given almost $500 million in climate spending. It supports initiatives such as phasing out coal usage, increasing renewables, scaling decarbonization strategies, and supporting large-scale land restoration activities. I know also SIF is a supporter of Extinction Rebellion, as is SIF's co-founder. So Sonia, I was hoping you could talk about, in some of these focus areas that SIF has chosen to fund, what you see as the role of social movements.
Thank you so much, and it is a real pleasure to be here. Thanks so much to Alliance for convening such a timely and an important conversation. So as you have heard, SIF was established about 2 decades ago with a focus on child health and malnutrition in developing countries, and this very much continues. But as most people in this call or everyone here will recognize, tackling climate change is absolutely crucial to making a difference to children living in poverty today and in the future. So this is very much about addressing today's concerns and not only about future generations. We completely recognize that philanthropy is well placed to support movement building. We are society's most flexible capital, and we consider that philanthropy has a responsibility to fund what others can't, particularly what governments cannot fund. And therefore, we are uniquely placed to support movements and campaigns. Unfortunately, less than 2% of philanthropic giving globally has been directed to climate change so far. So it is extremely small. And an even smaller proportion of that has been used for movement building. And traditionally, the philanthropic community and the NGO community has depended primarily, because potentially this very small amount of money, on technocratic solutions. And by that I mean elite lobbying, focus on international negotiations, or really focus on good policy design and development. And those, to be honest, are very effective, and they are very good ways of going about impacting on climate, but it is far from enough. Politicians and decision makers, as a result, have been supported to a certain extent through these technocratic solutions, but have not felt the pressure to act that matches the scale and severity of the climate crisis. So with that, I completely agreed with Clare and Nnimmo as they were talking earlier. So it is clear that funders could and should invest more in mass communications, culture, campaigning, and we intend to do more ourselves. And as a result, we have been expanding the team, and our director of comms, campaigns, movement building and culture, who recently joined us, will be helping us do exactly that. Now, you ask what may be the barriers, and because the opportunities are clearly there for funders to consider. I would think there are more considerations than barriers themselves. We need to ensure that funding, is not divisive. We have seen how climate can become a polarizing issue, and that is not something that we can encourage, that we shouldn't encourage. It is vital that we bring in new voices, and that the climate action is really owned broadly across society. And particularly center-right audiences need to be engaged, which traditionally have been felt less engaged. And therefore, we must avert at all costs a climate culture war. We also need to ensure that all campaigns, movement buildings, culture, all of this work is very well connected, and with the political advocacy that continues and must continue, and that depends on a strong and trusted relationships with key governments and world leaders. So, by funding one thing, we shouldn't burn bridges on others, because it is a complex theory of change, and all tactics are required to really achieve the change that we need. Also, it is a consideration for funders to evaluate and manage the risk to activists that we support. We take that risk very seriously, and it is of particular concern where in countries where civic space is shrinking, or where there has been threats to their well-being. How do we protect frontline defenders is a primary concern for ours. And also funders must abide by the rule of law. So, for example, you mentioned our donation to Extinction Rebellion, which we are so proud about. I think what the Extinction Rebellion has done is absolutely amazing. And they have done vital work to wake people up to the climate crisis. But our funding, we were prevented from deploying it for civil disobedience, as Claire mentioned. It was, however, put to good use on education, materials, training, and workshops, we are very happy about. So just to finish, I think with the right support, we can make the climate movement bigger, more compelling, more sophisticated, and more impactful. And funders can enhance the capacity and connectivity between key groups in order to align and amplify our efforts around key policy battles. And I think this is what I want to underline the most, is that enhancement of the capacity and the connectivity, and make it an all society effort and an all tactic effort that will accelerate the change that we want to see. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Just a follow-up question before we move on. I thought some of the comments that you made about not burning bridges and avoiding a climate culture war were very interesting, and also what you shared about where the donation for Extinction Rebellion, how it ended up getting used. So I was wondering if you could maybe share a bit about CIF's ideology when it comes to deciding what movements to fund and how to support them.
I'm sorry, I lost audio for a second and I couldn't hear the question. Could you repeat?
Oh, no worries. I was just saying, I think some of the comments you made about, avoiding a climate culture war and not burning bridges, I think that was really interesting. Also, given what you were telling us about the funding for Extinction Rebellion. So could you share some of CIF's ideology, I guess, when it comes to deciding which movements to fund and also how to fund them?
I mean, we don't have an ideology. The objective is to secure the impact and the acceleration of action. We are driven by evidence and by the understanding of who are those that need to be engaged. So, for example, recent analysis conducted by More in Common, and a group that does polling and message testing in different countries, found out that environment is actually a very common concern around all groups within society, but the way in which you approach it and engage with the different groups is different. The message will be different. So for me, I would like to fund movement buildings that will appeal to every single one of these groups. And that may be different. Extinction Rebellion or Greenpeace or some of the big logos may appeal more to a more progressive, more urban elite audience. I know that that is a gross mischaracterization of things, but they may not always be compelling to a rural center-right audience. And we have to find ways in which there are movements that are compelling for those audiences as well, because we also need them.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, Sonia, was that it, or did we lose you for a second?
No, that's it.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Very interesting. Before we head into the Q&A section, we have one more poll question for everyone. So if you can once again turn your attention to the right-hand side of your screen, our question is about barriers. So in your experience, what is the biggest barrier for funders when it comes to supporting climate movements? Lack of organizational and fiduciary structures, concerns about reputational risks when movements are testing the boundaries of the law, lack of support and advice from philanthropy infrastructure bodies, or other. And if it's other, we would love to hear your insights in the chat, where there's already a lively and robust discussion taking place. So I'll just give this a couple seconds to let some of the answers come in, and then I'll share the results. All right, so I think people are still answering, but it looks like the biggest concern has to do with reputational risks when movements are testing the boundaries of the law. So actually, this sets us up quite well for a question that I have for Clare, which has to do with one of the benefits of movements, and I think from the perspective of funders, but also just the perspective of everyone, is that movements have the ability to engage public support and raise awareness of issues at the grassroots. So how do you reckon with some of the strategies of Extinction Rebellion that may be alienating the public, you know, things like stopping the trains, and, you know, how is that interfering with your relationships with philanthropy?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I guess the first thing to say is that having a decentralized setup, which means that people are welcome to go and do you know, self-organized actions, so long as they adhere with the principles and values of Extinction Rebellion, which includes, you know, a strict adherence to non-violence, among other things, does mean that sometimes, and I'm on the media team at the moment, so I'm very aware of how things can come flying at us without, sometimes without warning. It does mean that people will go and undertake actions, you know, of their own design, and they don't strictly have to take on, you know, a large centralized committee in order to get the approval to go ahead and do those actions. And so whilst I understand that lots of people found the train action very problematic, I also think that by contrast, you know, in April and even, you know, this year when we went on the streets in September, there was, you know, something that surprised me anyway, was the public support that we managed to gain, even though we were causing quite a lot of disruption. And, you know, without that scale of mass disruption, I don't think that the message would have gone home, you know. And when we were a kind of novelty, let's say in April last year, and certainly we surprised everybody, including the authorities, we were able to put a huge amount of infrastructure into our spaces, which made them very welcoming and very safe for people to be in. So, you know, in April, you might know that we had people built compost toilets, people put up tents with kitchens inside and gave away free food constantly on the street to anybody who wanted it. Those kinds of things that support good action are harder now, because we find it really, really difficult in London, at least, to get our infrastructure in place, which provides the kind of comfort and support and the positivity to the spaces that we create. So we know that now the police have taken that a harder approach to preventing us from getting set up as well as we once did. And that really makes it quite challenging to move forwards, because we can't continue to do things in the same way again and again, which we might have liked to do alongside, you know, building bigger numbers as we go. And so now what we've got is a kind of a focus on more storytelling through actions and more pointed actions that show, I hope, also the sort of the movement growing up and becoming more sophisticated, in the sense of going and doing the action at the Broxbourne Printworks, doing actions outside Tufton Street, which for those of you who don't know is a street in central London, quite close to Westminster, and where lots and lots of think tanks and lobbyists work, who are really a fundamental piece of the sort of power dynamics and infrastructure of the sort of the rot and the corruption in British politics. And so in that way, I think the public and the media and broadly people who are watching the movement as it develops, I hope, have seen that we've had to change tactics and we've had to evolve and grow whilst we've gone through COVID as well, which created a contraction in numbers, partly because part of our model relies very much on public meeting and face-to-face engagement between individuals, because, you know, we didn't build Extinction Rebellion through Facebook. We didn't do it with a hashtag. We did it with consistent and prolonged period of face-to-face on the ground organising, which has been, you know, stopped by COVID. And so, yeah, I think we were sort of suggested to at the beginning that, you know, perhaps these kinds of tactics would be very alienating for the public and very difficult for people to deal with. But at the same rate, I think that, you know, the initial burst of very, very public disruption made sense in order to really get the message out there that we're in an emergency that affects every single person. Now, I hope people are seeing that, you know, we're trying to find smart and innovative ways to move forwards with actions that work perhaps slightly differently. But whilst we also know that we need to go back to mobilising and back to growing the movement, because we need many, many more numbers. So I think in all honesty, one of the major things that needs to shift now is that we need to be able to support people to do more and more mass mobilizing. And it would be great as well to see more support for some of our sort of affiliated groups, which includes people who are working on fashion, the fashion industry. That campaign group have had a huge success, in my opinion, at shifting the conversation within the fashion industry. We've got Nnimmo Rebellion, we've got the Internationalist Solidarity Network, who are working to connect with struggles around the world. So there's a huge amount of kind of diversity within the space, which works in a variety of different ways. And so I think, yeah, it would be interesting to speak to anybody who's interested in funding climate action through XR about the diversity of possibilities that are there in terms of the different elements of the work that we're focusing on. But for sure, you know, our eyes are on these pillars of power. So the political, the financial institutions and the media, and laws that need to be changed. And I think, you know, there is a growing public acceptance that, you know, sometimes you have to break laws to make laws. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Claire. Our next question comes from Marlene Engelhorn, who asks, what are strategies here that get traditional philanthropy and funding outside of its box? Sonia, maybe you could answer this. I know you spoke earlier this week at a webinar hosted by Active Philanthropy, and they have a report that they've just put out about tools for engaging more funders when it comes to climate funding. So maybe you could share a few of your insights from that research.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you. I spend a lot of time on that because obviously it's really something that takes my sleep at night. As I said, because climate philanthropy is so tiny, only 2% of philanthropy is given to these issues. The large funders are really a handful. Over the last 10 years that we've been funding on these issues, it has been growing, but it has been growing slowly. I think this has started to change a lot because of movements on the street. I think Fridays for Future and XR and others have woken up not only politicians and society to the risk of the climate crisis, but also to a large extent funders, potential funders. I have to say that we are getting more and more questions. How do you do this? Where do you start? And how can you do it? And it's harder than it looks because funders, they love funding in their own silos. They love following, the mandates that they have from either their high net worth individual or from their boards or whatever. And they are not used to, or we're not used to funding collaboratively. And climate philanthropy is significantly different to philanthropy in other areas. Here we need to think global, but with a very strong local mindset in many ways. So a global mindset with local programs, but also the other way around. We need to be thinking that policy is a huge lever, but it has to be in a political context. You have to engage all members of society because only one part can be weaponized against the other, and then we are on green on world wars, etc. So how do you and the level of awareness even of climate? There has been such a disinformation campaign from those that want to slow action that you have to actually address the very basic questions sometimes when you start engaging with these funders, with these potential funders. So you have to take it step by step. And some of what we discussed at this Active Philanthropy event the other day was, and I encourage everybody on that call, was there is no right solutions for funding. There is no one recipe of you have to fund this or you have to fund that, or you have to start in renewables and 3 years later you can start funding food and then 5 years later you can do something else. The vast amount of opportunities to make a difference means that you just have to get going. Wherever resonates with you, where you can add value, will be helpful. So we are trying to codify the basics of climate, why the action, why it is important. We're starting to make connections. Funders find comfort on peer-to-peer networks and being able to address the concerns. Providing that report, for example, frames climate from very different lenses. So if you're a health funder, why climate matters. If you're a children's funder, why that matters. If you're an education funder, why that matters. If you're an arts and culture funder, why that matters. And how you can address it, because, of course, every funder will want to see their issue also reflected on it. But I will also say that what is really important, apart from peer-to-peer learning and codification of what has worked, sharing learnings on information on groups and recommendations, it is also creating pool funding. And I think some people in the chat were talking about, if you don't feel like you have either the capacity or the knowledge to do your own due diligence, there are people out there that you can trust. So give them the money and trust them to do the work, as Nnimmo also was saying. So at SIF, we try to do a lot of that. We create new institutions, new group, new foundations that are either dedicated and rooted locally, or they are specifically knowledgeable on a particular tactic, like, for example, litigation, which we also fund a huge amount on also on movement buildings or strategic communications. And funders find that also of comfort in terms of having other funders that have done it before and they can learn from, so they can engage in the process and learn by doing. So it is a combination, but that's some of it, Elika.
Thank you so much, Sonia. For the next question, I'm going to turn to Nnimmo. It comes from Mate Smet at the Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action, who asks, how can funders best support and center the demands and approaches of local movements and organizations, particularly from communities most affected by climate change?
Right. Thank you for that question. This is exactly what we get concerned about all the time, especially with understanding that climate action and the things needed at the grassroots by communities is not so much about what is happening in the negotiation halls during the conference of parties of the climate change, but really what are the existential issues that communities are confronted with on a daily basis. And so we have funders need to understand that global warming or climate change is a very broad-based environmental crisis. And so there are many aspects, many directions from where help can come to struggling communities and movements. This include communities and movements who are engaged in fight for land, for right to land, for example, right to land for farming purposes. There are groups who don't have access to land, who are not allowed to save seeds and to share seeds due to interests of agribusiness, big businesses. And now we do know that small-scale farmers are the ones who are cooling the planet. When they say agriculture is a major cause of global warming, you talk about industrial, chemical-based agriculture. We're not talking about small-scale farming, who are actually cooling the planet. So you find the task is for funders to locate these groups who are the family farmers, urban farmers working on agroecology, those who are struggling to stop extractivism, especially in the fossil fuel sector, and of course also helping communities to interrogate some concepts that are so popular, green economy, the global Green New Deal and stuff like that. People really sit down to interrogate and decolonize this concept. This is where to support by listening. Funders need to do a lot more of listening to the challenges at the grassroots. They have to a lot more to listen to what are the issues that are really needed to be done at the base, at the grassroots. The Global Greengrants, for example, gives up to nearly 1,000 grants in about 100 countries every year. Most of these grants are going to groups who are working on issues that are confronting them, global warming, climate change issues, confronting them in their communities, in their regions. By the time all this add up together, we believe it makes a big movement globally. And so picking up these groups and understanding also there are a lot of grassroots groups that don't have access to funders database. Funders need to look out, to actually consciously go out to identify movements and groups that can be supported. In the Global Greengrants, about 40% of the grantees that we support have never received any type of funding before. They're just some of them cannot complete complex forms, complex tax return form that funders require, as we saw in the first poll that we just took today. And so it means coming down to the level or the grassroots level where things are happening. It takes a lot of stepping down from the horse, so to speak, to see that people are really fighting on issues that affect their survival on a daily basis, and they know what the problems are. This is why in a decentralized participatory system or model of funding, the advisors who are embedded in the struggles are in a position to know what is really happening, what needs to support, what makes impact, and what adds up to something that's really helping to solve the problem.
Thank you so much, Nnimmo. So we're rapidly coming up on the end of our hour together. So I have just one more question, which maybe all three of you can address. Just elaborating on what Frederique Siedel said in the chat about foundations and funders using their influence to sort of urge the banks they work with to align with the Paris Accords. I know that COP26 is coming up next year, and I'm wondering if you could speak to how movements and funders are thinking about that, and maybe some areas where you see the possibility of them working together. So Claire, maybe if you could start and share with us some of your thoughts, and then we'll head on to Nnimmo and Sonia.
Yeah, sure. Well, we had a video recently filmed with George Monbiot. I don't know if we've shared it yet on our social media channels, but basically saying that these international negotiations have thus far, utterly failed humanity. And so to keep on doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results is not a smart move, particularly when so much is at stake. So I guess one thing that I think is important to think about is how to engage with that process when it's so clearly, so utterly, totally, terribly flawed in its design, right? I guess thinking about how foundations and funders and banks and the finance sector are all interconnected. This is also, for me, a huge issue where we see potential for a huge amount of greenwash, lots and lots of money in the finance sector going into promoting the marginal things that are being done well, in order to sort of give them something to celebrate, whilst the entirety of the sector en masse is totally culpable for the crisis that we're in a sense of global inequality through to funding fossil fuels and beyond. So I think those relationships are highly problematic. And I guess what I would say is that in order to sort of face the reality of what's going on here, I think it's good to think about what needs to change, the scale of what needs to change in the face of this moment, and how insanely challenging that seems to me to be, and how none of the business as usual practices, certainly in the finance sector and also beyond into like all forms of business, it's not going to be possible to keep very much looking and feeling the same as it does now, if we're going to really tackle things the way that we need to. So I guess it's not really a clear message, perhaps, but I think the openness to accept that the ideas might not come from these places where we're currently looking is kind of important. I think the idea of letting go of some of our sense of perceived wisdom and the places where we expect the solutions to come from might be really important. And I guess there's a huge sort of holding of access that the third sector, the NGOs, and others have in terms of like the access to these political processes and to people in positions of power. And so I think it's really important for this whole sector to take a look at its not just its financial resources, but its capacity for access, and ask whether or not it's really supporting voices who are not heard to be seen and to be heard, and to be able to find a way to be empowered in this space. Because at the moment, I agree with what's been discussed so far, that the sector isn't, I don't think, in enough close contact with the grassroots activists. It's not in enough close contact with movements and with people all over the world who really need their help. And so it's I totally think that comment about the listening process, which is needed, there's a huge amount of hours need to be put into that. And I'm afraid I don't really have any particular wisdom on COP26, which I don't see any I struggle personally to see much potential in the COP process. But I think there are people looking at alternatives to bring ordinary folks together. And so there's something I'm aware of, which is a global citizens assembly, which people are working on. And in that, bringing a sortition-based, so randomly selected group of citizens together. So there's 1,000 people from the world kind of family sitting together and deliberating about how they would best see the way through dealing with this on an international basis. And so there are some people bringing forward kind of real innovation from the grassroots, which I think it would be good for the sector to seek out and find out how it can support that.
Thank you so much, Claire. Nnimmo and Sonia, did you have any final thoughts to share on this question, maybe in the next 2-3 minutes?
Sure. Thank you so much. I agree with Claire on what she just enunciated. Now, the climate negotiations have become arenas for avoidance of action. This happened almost from the beginning, but especially from Copenhagen, when the voluntary principles came into play, and then the Paris Agreement actually consolidated the pathways to non-action for climate change. So having the Paris Agreement as a basis for climate action is actually a faulty platform, really, because the basis of action in that platform is what they call nationally determined contributions, which means countries just determine what they can do, not mandatory, not legally binding, as the Kyoto Protocol was, for example. And so the moment nations move into voluntary actions, it just gives politicians the scope to say, well, this is what we're going to do, and then they may do it or may not do it. So funders really need to step beyond the Paris targets, knowing that they were very arbitrary, 1.5 degrees Celsius or well below 2 degrees since industrial temperature increase compared to industrial when the Industrial Revolution took place. That was very arbitrary, and it is not based on reality. And so far, the nationally determined contributions countries have put forward are pointing towards 3 degrees or 4 degrees or more temperature increase above pre-industrial levels, which means funders really need to go beyond those targets, recognize real emergencies on the ground, recognize the struggles on the ground, and support movements and groups to build resilience to withstand the compounded and unexpected occurrences like COVID-19 pandemic and social upheavals that we're seeing around the world. This is what is really needed at this time, not Paris targets, because Paris target is leading to serious climate catastrophe.
Thank you, Nnimmo. Sonia, if you have any final thoughts on this question or on the discussion overall, I would love to hear that before we wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's such a rich discussion. Of course, so much could be said. Look, I'm not going to be the defender of COP processes, but at the same time, I'd like to, in a way, defend it a bit, in the sense that it is absolutely right that bottom-up pressure and citizen assembly, I am a huge fan of activities like that, are absolutely required. And let's not forget that climate negotiators are representatives of governments, and those governments, when they feel the pressure from their citizens, they show up to these meetings in a different way. COP processes are a result of how that is felt domestically. So they never deliver on their own. National pressure, local pressure is very much delivered by the local context and the political economy on those countries, but they are forcing moments. We have no replacement other than the UN, where every single country in the world has a voice. The Paris Agreement provides the universal agreement to discuss these issues. It took us more than 20 years to get there, and it does have a mechanism to continue to ratchet the ambition. And without a Paris Agreement, China would, and without diplomatic pressure, China would not have been compelled to announce a carbon neutrality target by 2060, the EU one of 55%. Japan came today with a carbon neutrality target, Korea. These are forcing moments that are helpful, and they do bend the curve, but they don't deliver on their own, and they deliver only if there is pressure at the national level to these countries. So absolutely, that's right. And they don't deliver on their own because there has to be change in the real economy. There has been comments about the finance industry is full of greenwashing. I completely agree, right? And companies completely agree, right? So we need to call bullshit on all of that. Out of 40,000 listed companies in the world, less than 0.5%, 200 have a climate action plan that is aligned with a 1.5-degree world. Absolutely ridiculous and absolutely wrong. So we need to call that, and it's the accountability and the transparency that will help us deliver there. So as I said at the beginning of, I think we need all sorts of tactics, all sorts of groups. We need new voices. We need to drive transparency, but let's not discard any particular venue because everything has a role. Thank you, Elika.
Thank you so much, Sonia. And thank you to everyone who's participated today. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion. And if you found it helpful and engaging, I would encourage you to take advantage of our subscription offer, which will give you access to independent opinion, expert debate, and trusted insight. You can subscribe at alliancemagazine.org using the code CLIMATE20 for a 20% discount and a free print edition of our issue on social movements. I'd like to end by saying thank you to our expert panelists, Sonia, Nnimmo, and Claire. Thank you to our sponsor, Fondation du France. Thank you to the Alliance team, in particular, our partnerships and comms manager, Zibran Chowdhury, and our marketing, advertising, and events manager, Amy McGoldrick, who have produced today's event. And thank you to all of you for being part of the Alliance community today. Our webinar series continues next month when we'll be taking a look at Indigenous philanthropy, which was the subject of an in-depth special feature from earlier this year. And we're devoting the next issue of Alliance to the latest in global health philanthropy. It's guest edited by colleagues at the Open Society Foundations, and it comes out on the 1st of December. Get in touch to order your copy now. Thank you for joining us today, and goodbye.